Good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Ewalt. I'm Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism for the Texas Tribune. Welcome to those joining us here in person, here in Austin, and online for today's conversation, breaking down the 2024 Texas primary results. We are joined today by the Tribune's Washington correspondent, Matthew Choi, Tribune politics reporter, Zach Despart, Renzo Downey, lead writer of The Blast, the Tribune's premium politics newsletter, and Alexandra Samuels, senior editor at Texas Monthly. And our moderator is Tribune managing editor for news and politics, Matthew Watkins. Today's program will run an hour with 45 minutes for conversation and 15 minutes for your questions. Here in Austin, we have a microphone for questions, and our virtual audience can also submit questions online using our Q&A portal. That's at texastribune.org/ask. We are grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsor for today's event is Raise Your Hand Texas. Though corporate sponsors and donors underwrite this event, they play no role in determining the content, speakers, or line of questioning. And on behalf of my Tribune colleagues, including those who stayed up very late last night covering the primary, I want to thank all of those throughout the state of Texas who support the impactful journalism of the Tribune, including those who have become members. To learn more and to become a member, visit texastribune.org/support. We also have a number of events in Austin and around the state through the rest of this month and into the spring. On March 20th, we partner with the LBJ Urban Lab on a program examining the critical role of childcare in Texas communities. On March 27th in Houston, we host a conversation titled Faith and Public Life as part of our year-long We the Texans initiative, looking at how people of faith are working to break down barriers and solve some of the state's biggest problems. And we stay in Houston for a program on March 28th titled Texas and the Race to Provide the World's Clean Energy. To learn more about these events and several we have scheduled for April, visit texastribune.org/events. Now let's get to know our panel. Matthew Choi is a Washington correspondent for the Texas Tribune. He previously covered energy and climate policy at Politico, where he wrote the morning energy newsletter and covered campaign events as a breaking news reporter during the 2020 presidential election and the Mueller investigation. Zach Despart is a politics reporter for the Tribune. He investigates power, who wields it, how and to what ends in Texas government. He covered the Uvalde school shooting extensively, including a groundbreaking investigation on the role the gunman's rifle played in the disastrous police response. He previously covered Harris County for the Houston Chronicle. Renzo Downey is the lead writer of The Blast, the Texas Tribune's premium politics newsletter. Prior to joining the Tribune in February 2023, he worked as a state government and politics reporter and a newsletter editor for Florida Politics. He was previously an intern on the state desk at the Austin American Statesman. Alexandra Samuels is a senior editor at Texas Monthly. Born in Boston, she moved to Texas officially in 2001 and has been writing about the state since 2016. Alexandra, whose work primarily focuses on the intersection of race and politics, has had her work featured in various publications, including 538, the New York Times, Washington Post, ABC News, ProPublica, and the Texas Tribune. And our moderator today, Matthew Watkins, oversees the day-to-day planning for news coverage. He began working at the Tribune in 2015 and was previously a reporter, breaking news editor, and politics editor. He also worked as a reporter at the Dallas Morning News and the Eagle and Bryan College Station. I thank our panel and our audience for being here today, and with that, I turn the program over to Matthew.
All right, thanks, Matt, and thanks to everyone for being here, particularly the four people up here on stage, all of whom worked past midnight last night, many as late as 2 a.m. So we're bleary-eyed. It's been a big 24 hours, though, and excited to talk about it. As Matt mentioned, I've been at the Tribune for over 9 years now, and during that time, one of the big stories has always been sort of the push and pull, the battle between the more insurgent wing of the GOP party and what, at least when I started, was the more establishment wing of the party. On Tuesday night, the insurgents landed what I would say is probably the biggest blow in that battle since I've been covering Texas politics. It was a massive night in politics. At the top of that, of course, is House Speaker Dade Phelan being forced into a runoff against David Covey. Phelan finishing second place in that vote, getting 43% of the vote compared to 46 from Covey. There were 9 House incumbent Republicans who lost last night. J.C. Jatan, Jill Dutton, Travis Clardy, Ernest Bales, Hugh Shine, Glenn Rogers, Reggie Smith, Kronda Thimish, Steve Allison. I think it's fair to say that all of those lost to challengers who were running to the right of them as opposed to from the center. We have another 8 candidates, I won't list them off, but who are going into runoffs in May. So, more damage possibly coming to incumbents in the future. In Congress, Tony Gonzalez, one of the, a conservative member, but one of the more moderate members of the Texas delegation, forced into a runoff. A right-wing influencer, Brandon Gill, wins CD26 outright, replacing Michael Burgess in that seat. 3 criminal court of appeals judges who had been targeted by Ken Paxton because of a ruling he disliked that they issued, saying essentially that Ken Paxton didn't have the power to unilaterally pursue voter fraud cases. All 3 of them, the only 3 up for re-election last night, were ousted. We had a state board of education incumbent lose, 2 more forced into a runoff. And of course, the biggest insurgent of them all, Donald Trump, received 77.9% of the vote in the Texas primary. So a pretty major night in Texas politics. I want to start with Phelan because I think, to me, that's the headline, and I'm going to start with you, Zach. Give us a little bit of the background of that race before we get into what happened.
Sure. I mean, I think it's worth underscoring just the seismic nature of what happened in the Texas House last night. It's really hard to beat incumbents in Texas primaries generally, is sort of how it's structured. But if we look at just 2 years ago, there were 19 or so House incumbents that faced challengers that Dade Phelan supported as Speaker. All of them survived. Dade Phelan did not face a challenger. This year, we have 9 lose outright, 8 are in runoffs. The House Speaker of Texas, the head of the lower chamber of the legislature, is into a runoff, and he trails in that race. To a really a political newcomer, a man named David Covey, who's the former chairman of the Orange County Republican Party. I mean, this, the saying, all politics is local. I mean, all politics is national, man, because this race is not about really the 200,000 voters that live in House District 21, this kind of weird corner of Texas that's anchored by Beaumont on the Louisiana border. This Dade Phelan polling consistently has shown is the least popular statewide Republican, which is generally bad news if you're him. But in normal cycles matters less because House speakers are only elected by the people in their district. So as long as they maintain good relations there, they're going to be okay. Phelan ran on that. He had said, I have been in the House for 5 terms. I've ascended unlikely from not one of the Texas big cities to become the first House Speaker from Beaumont. I've delivered all these things for my district on education, supporting the oil and gas industry. That didn't end up really mattering that much. This race had become a measure of how strong is the far right in Texas, because Covey was backed by Donald Trump. He was backed by Dan Patrick. He was backed by Ken Paxton, who came all the way to Beaumont to campaign for him. And Governor Abbott really sat out this race, which like a lot of people took as, we kind of hear what we want to hear about that. But in the end, that was enough to force Phelan in a runoff, and that is a significant outcome for a Texas House Speaker.
Alex, we as journalists, we like to find narratives. We like to, have tidy stories to tell. And a lot of times this sort of gets portrayed as, the moderates versus the conservatives. But Dade Phelan was a pretty conservative guy. I mean, unlicensed carry of handguns, passed what is at the time the most restrictive abortion law in the state, billions of dollars towards border security. How did we get to the point where Dade Phelan was not conservative enough for his district?
I think you guys hit on this in the profile that you did of Phelan. It wasn't necessarily all the bills that he helped pass as speaker, but I think the main thing that got him in the crosshairs of some members of the far right was that he kind of led the charge of impeaching Ken Paxton. And I think that's what, obviously Paxton was a big involvement in that race. Paxton is very close to Trump, so is Dan Patrick, who offered a pretty scathing rebuke of the House and the House impeachment process after it happened and after Paxton was acquitted in the Senate. So I think that was the main thing that really, put Phelan in the crosshairs of the far right. And now going into a runoff, I think he's arguably seen somewhat as like a weaker candidate. We were discussing this in our newsroom last night. If Phelan wins a runoff, could he still be speaker? Like that's a question I'm still wrestling with on my own. But I think he definitely goes into 2025, whether even if he wins, just as being seen as weaker than he was before.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. But first, Renzo, I just want to talk about, this is going to be a hell of a runoff, right? This is not your average state house low profile runoff. Give us a little bit of a preview of what we should expect over the next couple months.
Yeah, well, coming up next is going to be this runoff, but you also have school board races coming up. That's going to really put the focus on public education when it, border is the biggest issue right now for voters, and I think you may have seen some of that play out last night. But I think you might see public education become even more of a central part of the election in the coming months.
So, it's not just Phelan, it's these 9 other incumbents who lost, and maybe more to come. Zach, how do you see this changing the Texas House? Is it too soon to tell?
Yes and no. Classic politics answer. I think that undeniably we will see the House shift further towards the right. Like you said, like none of the challengers are running from the center. So anybody that wins is going to pull the body. I think sort of what Alex touched on, the speaker Phelan remains speaker. The House will be a less independent body of the legislature. I think it will be under tremendous pressure based on the outcome last night to do what the Senate and what Governor Abbott want them to do. In that way, it'll be less of sort of a check on the other parts of the government. Yeah.
So, Alex, you already mentioned Phelan. Hard to imagine that he doesn't come out of this, even if he emerges victorious weekend, right? It's going to be, first of all, we should just state, it's going to be very hard for him to win this race, right? When you're an incumbent and you don't get 50% of the vote in that first round, that means more than 50% of the voters wanted someone else, right? And it's a different group of voters that comes the next time and all that, but it's generally not a great sign. But then also he lost. He led a lot of voters through a session that then brought all kinds of backlash to them. I do wonder, what if he can make it through this, what the response of the members who vote him into power is going to be there.
Yeah, I have a similar question because I think the first question is, will Phelan win? And like you said, it's going to be a very hard race. And I think we did a Text-Plainer on this like way back in the day. And we found that in the first place finisher, typically it goes on to win in runoff races. Can't say for sure whether that will be the case in the Phelan-Covey race, but that is the trend so far. But then even if Phelan is elected, if he's elected back into the House, then he's going to have to convince probably a coalition of Democrats and maybe some of his Republican friends that, hey, I should still be speaker, because as Zach got at, the House really does serve as a check on power for both, Paxton and the Senate. I think that's going to be a tall ask for Phelan. I think especially with the flack that he's received for elevating Democrats to committee chairs, even though we know that's something that House speakers preceding Phelan have done, and it has never really been a problem. Even Dan Patrick did it with Whitmire. But I think Phelan's just going to be seen as like somebody who's almost too tainted to be speaker in a way. And that now you have members who have been elected who are, running more to the right and who have been elected. And I think a lot of them are going to have trouble swallowing a Phelan speakership round 2.
Renzo, that being said, I mean, Phelan left the most recent round of sessions with a lot of support in the House. We point to impeachment, but he had quite a bit of support, including a majority of Republicans backing him. It's quite a reversal here in terms of reversal of fortunes, I guess.
Yeah, I think you've seen a few members of leadership, come out this primary cycle specifically in support of Phelan, but it hasn't been, that they haven't been that forthcoming. You kind of have to pry it out of them. And several of these insurgent grassroots winners last night, they specifically campaigned against Phelan as House Speaker. And, I think that he's going to have a real tough fight.
I would add real quick that in some ways, being the House Speaker is a lousy job, right? So, I mean, there's no shortage of power-hungry legislators in the Capitol. But you have to wonder at some point, who would actually want to be Speaker if not Phelan. I have a hard time believing that Dan Patrick, as aggressive as he has been as the president of the Senate, that he would accept a House Speaker that is anything but subservient to what he wants to do. So, I mean, anybody that inherits the job, I think, is in a tough spot.
I totally agree with that. And the only thing I'll add is that with all these new members coming in, like one thing Phelan had under his belt was like seniority. So it's like, who are the next like senior members in the House who also maybe were not affiliated with Phelan? Because I don't know if like the big committee chairs are going to be seen as like too close to Phelan to be seen as like a next best choice for House Speaker. So then it becomes, I don't know, who's left in the House. Like you said, there's a lot of power-hungry members of the Ledge who I'm sure would love that position, but it's going to be interesting to see who the Republican caucus ultimately backs.
I just want to kind of put this in a bit of like broader long-term historical context of like the last 10 years of Texas politics too. So, in 2014, you have, in the time before then, a lot of times the Senate was seen as the more kind of moderating force in Texas politics. And one of the big reasons was who presided over the Senate, David Dewhurst, but also the rules of the Senate in which, basically any bill needed to pass to get 2/3 support of the members in order to reach the floor. Dan Patrick unseats David Dewhurst in 2024. He gets rid of that 2/3 rule. He had been sort of seen as this sort of type of insurgent candidate, sort of a fringe senator, essentially, takes control of that chamber. All of a sudden, the House kind of becomes the moderating force in 2015. In 2016, Donald Trump is elected president, but a lot of the leadership of this state, including Greg Abbott, kind of kept their distance from them at the time. 2017, you have the bathroom bill, Dan Patrick really showing his conservative aggression. The moderate House Speaker, Joe Strauss, shoots that down, rejects it. He eventually kind of gets tired of leading the rancorous House, leaves, and is replaced by Dennis Bonnen. In 2018, you have Beto O'Rourke almost knocking off Ted Cruz, Dennis Bonnen becoming the next speaker, and you have the following session of being the school funding session and the property taxes session. We called it a lot of times, Alex, maybe too many times, the bread and butter session, right? We're moving away from the social issues, and we're focusing on these kind of pocketbook issues, the school issues as well. Dennis Bonnen ousted. 2020 comes around, Trump reelected. 2021, Dade Phelan comes in. As we mentioned, he passes most restrictive abortion bill in the country. He passes permitless carry, something that even Dan Patrick was kind of uncomfortable with. Moving on to 2023, Phelan, impeaches Ken Paxton. He is this very conservative force, many people saying the most conservative speaker in Texas history, still not conservative enough. And now, viewed as sort of the last moderating force in the Texas legislature. And now we're staring at a situation where that person might be gone too. And I don't know. I mean, Alex, if he's gone, what is the the governor, and I don't mean like Governor Abbott, I mean like the governor on the car keeping things from speeding even faster than they already are?
I mean, kind of like you got at, like, Phelan was not a moderate. It's really that he did this one thing, and that one thing being kind of Paxton impeachment. And now he's on the outs with his party. So now, what does Governor Abbott do now? I would assume that he would want a speaker who is kind of like more just willing to do what Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick want without much pushback. I'm not sure who that member is, or if we can get enough of the GOP caucus to coalesce around a member like that. But I assume if Republicans want another like bread and butter kind of easy session where we're not called back a million times for special sessions, they're going to want somebody who will, is pro voucher, is pro, border wall, is pro, all these other issues that are important to the most conservative Texas primary voters. Are going to want to elect somebody like that and have that in that position.
These House races were about Phelan, but they were also very much about Ken Paxton and Greg Abbott. Renzo, you were helping kind of track the votes on that and how each of them fared in their attempts to influence these elections. Greg Abbott, of course, trying to get pro-school voucher candidates in there. Ken Paxton, of course, trying to punish people who voted for his impeachment. How did each of them fare last night?
Yeah, so Abbott was a bit more targeted with the incumbents he was trying to oust. He endorsed in most of those races, 10 specifically, going after incumbent Republicans who were opposed to school vouchers. He performed, I believe, 1-7. Is that what we were at last? That's a pretty good track record, especially coming off of the last time he tried going after incumbents and didn't perform very well. Meanwhile, Ken Paxton, he endorsed basically anybody who was going after an incumbent, and he didn't have such a good track record. Also, President Trump, he performed even better than Abbott did with his endorsements. And in the current Texas Republican Party, you're probably still seeing Donald Trump being big influence, especially when it comes to some of these lesser known candidates. If you see Trump's name next to a guy, that's probably your guy.
Since Abbott became governor in 2015, I think one of the conversations some of his critics had was that he did not wield the power of a Rick Perry or some of the other more powerful figures in Texas history. As you said, there have been times where he's gone against incumbents in the past. It didn't go so well. School vouchers, he really, really kind of made his top issue last year, was unable to force it through. Do you think how his power is perceived changed last night, Zach?
I think it's a little bit harder to measure. There's a lot of variables, right? Because all of the, or almost all of the anti-voucher incumbents that Renzo mentioned were also pro-impeachment, right? So I think that Abbott was targeted and careful in who he went after, but also it was a pretty fertile environment for challengers. So hard to measure which was more powerful.
All right, Matthew, you've been sitting patiently as we go through the state issues. Let's shift gears to Congress for a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the Tony Gonzalez race.
Yeah, this was really interesting. Tony Gonzalez, he is probably the most centrist. He hates the word moderate, but he's probably the most centrist Republican in the Texas delegation. He loves working across the aisle, but also across the rotunda with the Senate as well. This is his first re-election campaign since being censured by the Republican Party for a number of votes that Texas Republicans thought were not conservative enough. And he attracted quite a few major challengers, including Julie Clark, who was the Medina County GOP chair, who first launched that censure motion. But it turns out that his, bajillion dollars, he's a prolific fundraiser, wasn't enough to protect him from going to a runoff with Brandon Herrera, who isn't really is not like the other challengers. He made his name more online than in the district. He's a YouTuber, predominantly focusing on Second Amendment issues, increased access to guns. Mind you, this is the district that contains Uvalde as well. And a lot of his donations came from out of state. So it was a real shaking up of Tony Gonzalez's comfort, I suppose.
This was not a Phelan type pulled into a runoff, though. He did. Gonzalez did have a fairly significant lead, in just couldn't get over that 50% hump, right?
Correct. Yeah, and it was largely because there were quite a few candidates who actually had a viable challenge to him. So if Julie Clark, for example, weren't there, probably would have been a little bit easier for him.
Of course, as we mentioned before, it's never great to get under 50% of the vote in your primary, even if you do have a nice lead there. So that'll be interesting to watch. You mentioned kind of people who kind of built their reputation online. Tell us about Brandon Gill up in CD 26.
Yeah, so Brandon Gill, he outright won the primary to replace Congressman Michael Burgess. Burgess has been in Congress for 11 terms. He's one of the most senior Republicans on some of the most coveted committee assignments in Congress, and he's most likely going to be replaced by a 30-year-old influencer, I suppose, who has no formal political experience whatsoever, but he has a lot of very powerful friends. His father-in-law is Dinesh D'Souza. He had backing from Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, the House Freedom Caucus, and he really kind of wants to go to Congress to be one of quite explicitly Trump's biggest defender in Congress.
And then on the Democratic side, a lot of interesting races. Alex, Colin Allred had a pretty good night. Were you surprised by how the margin that he won by?
I actually was. I was shocked in the sense that there was only one poll in the lead up to yesterday that showed Allred netting above 50%, and I think he had 52% support, and that was still within the margin of error of being entering runoff territory. But you have to remember, in primaries, not a lot of people are voting. The early vote numbers were terrible, particularly for Democrats, which told me at least that there wasn't a lot of excitement for the presidential race. Of course, Biden kind of had the race locked in, and Allred spent a lot of his resources not necessarily traveling the state during the primary, but kind of conserving the money that he has for a general election against Cruz. I did think it would go to a runoff just because it seemed like, there were, I think, 9 candidates in the race. And I think with so many candidates, it's really hard for one to win outright and get above that 50% threshold. But Allred had a fantastic night. I mean, now he can use the money that he has. He doesn't have to worry about what would have probably been a more grueling runoff against likely Roland Gutierrez, who's a state senator. Now he can focus that money and resources on a general election against Cruz.
Matthew, I got to say, I have watched that race. We, of course, all remember the Beto run in 2018. And it felt to me like by this point, Beto had really started to build some excitement in the state. I have watched Colin Allred. He, of course, congressman from Dallas, backed by a lot of the party establishment, and have sort of not felt that same level of hype, from the grassroots around him. How do you assess his? I mean, this was a big kind of eye opener, though, to see him win, pretty easily here over a candidate in Gutierrez who was pretty energetic in his campaigning, was in the news a lot over the last couple of years. Of course, represents Uvalde in his district in the state Senate, and just to be honest, right, has a Hispanic surname, which often helps in Democratic primaries. He ended up with, I think, 16% of the vote. Not even really coming close. What, if anything, does that tell you about Allred looking forward?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a couple of things. I mean, Allred, first of all, if you look at the amount of money that Allred raised relative to Gutierrez, it's absurd. It's like 20 times as much money. He was by far the absolute favorite among Washington Democrats. He's very well liked in Washington. He is just interpersonally, but also, I mean, he had more opportunities to like work across the aisle as a member of the majority. Beto was never part of the majority. That said, Beto had a bit more of a tabula rasa because of that. He didn't really, he never really was in the spotlight because the Democratic Party was not really much in the spotlight at the time. He also was able to benefit from the 2018 midterm elections when Trump was at the top of the ticket. So that was a huge kind of boost to him. Also, a lot of people just talk about how Beto is just kind of a unique person, just like a prodigious, almost messianic figure. And I don't think it's really fair to ding Allred for not being that, because, I mean, that's not really a standard, that's more of an exception.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of open for debate whether that sort of messianic figure, that adoration that Beto generated, worked for him against him. I think, he came very close to upsetting Ted Cruz in 2018, so I don't want to downgrade or downplay that, but, there were also people who kind of got a little bit tired of him and maybe associated him as, lacking in substance, things like that.
And Allred is kind of shifting his strategy away from that. I mean, he's much more explicit about saying, I'm not a messianic figure, but I am also not Ted Cruz. So if you don't like Ted Cruz, hello. He also is focusing a lot on his legislative accomplishments. I mean, he was in Congress. He was in the majority when they passed some of the biggest infrastructure and climate legislation in American history. And he, representing a lot of oil and gas interests and also clean energy interests, really kind of it's like touting his hand in that as well.
Alex, Donald Trump, 77.9%. Is there anything else to say? I mean, Texas Republicans love the guy.
They do, and they have for years and years now. I don't think that's changed. It wasn't, I don't think, shocking to anyone in here that he won the state pretty handily. And yeah, I think I saw this morning that Nikki Haley plans to drop out. I think it was around like 10 Eastern Central. I didn't get the time zone, but she should be making her exit here soon. So yeah, Trump still remains kingmaker in Texas. I think it was Renzo who said earlier that even Trump's endorsed candidates, I think, did better than Abbott and Paxton if we're like doing a roundup of it. So yeah, Trump still definitely remains king in Texas.
Zach, I want to talk to you a little bit about accountability. In some ways, accountability was a theme of the night. In other ways, in kind of both directions, right? We saw candidates, the Court of Criminal Appeals races that I mentioned at the beginning, of course, feeling some of this. A lot of people held accountable for what they would argue were attempts to hold members of their own party accountable. What do you, if anything, do you think the results say about the Republican Party's willingness and desire to kind of self-police?
Yeah, I mean, I think accountability is in the eye of the beholder. I think if you asked a lot of primary voters, they would say that the results show that the grassroots held the House accountable for being far too accommodating to Democrats and for betraying conservative values. I think they would look at that as accountability. If you talk to the members of the House, by far the majority of even the Republicans who supported impeachment, they would say, we did this really brave, ethical thing of holding a statewide Republican accountable for egregious corruption, and now we're paying the price for it. If you look at sort of, what it's cost them, and this kind of flies under the radar, but Andrew Murr, the representative who had actually led the impeachment in the House, retired late last year. He would have faced a tough re-election. His main rival won handily last night. Of course, the House Speaker, that was largely a referendum on his support for Paxton. So, I mean, the argument for the Phelons and the Murrs of the world is like, yes, in the short term, Republicans can still win, but they make the argument that we become less competitive and more vulnerable as a party if we tolerate the kind of corruption that Ken Paxton has openly done in the past and in their view will likely do in the future. It hasn't cost Republicans anything yet, but we'll see in a few cycles.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be fascinating because we have all these runoffs in the House, and we expect Ken Paxton to be a prominent voice in those runoffs. We also expect that, barring any kind of delay between now and April 15th, for Ken Paxton to be amid a felony criminal trial for state securities fraud during that time. So it's going to be a very interesting time in Texas politics. I want to go down the line here and just ask each of you about a race that maybe stood out to you a little bit more under the radar. Under the radar meaning we haven't talked about it yet, and just tell us, what that race was and what you found interesting about it. I'll start with you, Zach, since you're right here next to me.
Sure. I'm going to pick a race I wrote about for selfish reasons. So we've talked tremendously about Republicans here, which is important. They control the state. On the Democratic side, there were a couple interesting races. One of them I covered was House District 146, where the incumbent Democrat, Sean Thierry, had come under tremendous criticism because she had supported Republican bills that were opposed by the LGBT community last year. It's tough to be a Democrat in Texas, right? So I think you kind of look for the wins where you can get them. And Democrats really felt in this race that she had betrayed the party, that there shouldn't be room in the party, which is so embracing of the LGBT community, to have really any divergence on that. So the establishment really poured a lot of resources and endorsements into the race. As of this morning, her challenger was just shy of 50%. So it looks like that will be a runoff. Again, like Matthew said, if you don't, as an incumbent, come away with 50%, you're in big trouble. And the third candidate in the race, most of those votes likely go to the challenger. So I think Thierry's in trouble, but that's interesting race on the Democratic side.
Yeah, that's one of the few examples, I think, of the kind of, the incumbent being targeted, the incumbent or the establishment choice being kind of in trouble on the Democratic side. That kind of insurgent push of the GOP we are not seeing translate as much in Democrats in Texas, perhaps because it's easier to rally together when you're wanting to win something. Matthew, what about you? What stood out to you?
I was really fascinated with the 12th congressional district that's currently represented by Kate Granger. That was probably the most apparent Phelan-Paxton race in the U.S. Congress. Dade Phelan, endorsed Craig Goldman, who current member of the Texas House, who's very closely aligned ideologically in terms of endorsements, in terms of relations with the Fort Worth business community, with Kate Granger. And he had, raised like $1 bajillion, and he seemed to be kind of a shoo-in for that. And then John O'Shea, who is a close friend of Ken Paxton, a business owner from Fort Worth, he was able to make it into a runoff. So that was a really interesting kind of confluence of both state and federal politics.
Renzo, give us one.
Yeah, well, one race I can't get out of my mind is the J.C. Jaton race. That was, I can't explain that one personally. This was a Abbott-backed incumbent, pro-vouchers, had a Paxton-backed impeachment-based challenger. And this is an incumbent who worked with the governor's office, helped the House get past border policy, and for nothing, he lost outright. And
sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, yeah, he sponsored the border wall bill, right?
Yes,
in one of such.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the one that I'm focused on right now. If I can steal another one as well,
please.
Emblematic of the Abbott voucher fight, I think, is the Hillary Hickland ousting of Hugh Shine, who this is a long-term incumbent. He had come in the 80s, ran for Congress unsuccessfully. He came back in the last few years, ousted an incumbent Republican to take that seat back, and that kind of became the flagship race for Abbott. And you saw the grassroots turn out there, and now you're looking at Hillary Hickland as that next state rep.
I really agree with you on the J.C. Chaton one. That really stood out to me as well. And it's one of those things where I think it says something about what the GOP electorate, primary electorate, wants and its members right now, because he, as you said, he did have his hand in a lot of some of the more conservative measures, was on board with vouchers and things like that, but also just kind of carried himself like in a more kind of like friendly and conciliatory manner. And I wonder whether that impacted kind of how he was perceived by, whether people trusted that he was really one of them in the GOP primary.
Yeah, and another tidbit about J.C. Chaton, he basically missed the very end of legislating this past year because he was serving. He ended up, tapping his wife to, help out officially. He's still the state rep, but she was serving his duties while he was tied up serving. So, that's the kind of character that you saw go down.
All right, Alex, what's your pick?
I just want to say one quick thing on the Chaton race, which I think it was in 2018. So that seat used to be represented by Rick Miller, but then Rick Miller made some racist remarks about how he had so many Asian American challengers, Chaton being one of them. And Rick Miller ended up dropping out of the race, if I recall, and then Chaton went on to win. And so there is somewhat of an irony now, looking back on it, that he's about to be replaced by another white man in the legislature.
No, and that's a really interesting point, and it makes me think back to one of the things I was talking about going through that history, right? About what used to be up for debate or even kind of unacceptable among voters in that primary is now less so, right? Like we talked about the bathroom bill in 2017, a bill that was this huge fight and did not end up passing. And you look back at that bill now compared to some of the measures, related to trans kids and things like that, and it almost feels like tame. It almost feels like one of those bills that like would have just sailed through the House, and that's another example where Miller is, I think, Abbott came out and called for him to resign almost immediately when he made those comments, and there was this feeling of like, we're going to lose this seat and everything like that. Of course, redistricting changes a lot of that, and you don't have to really worry about losing that seat anymore, and I think that has an impact on kind of the calculus here. So yeah, good point, well said.
And the race that I will touch on is the Senate race between Nathan Johnson and Victoria Niave Criado. One thing that was interesting to me is like, why would you want to be a Democrat in Dan Patrick's Senate? That's a question I have for a lot of them. But I mean, Nathan Johnson won re-election pretty handily. The way that his district was redrawn was so, I think it went from a third Hispanic to like half Hispanic, I want to say. So I think that's a big reason why Niave decided to get into the race. But it's just so fascinating to me. Like we talked about how many Republicans are, probably climbing over themselves to become the next House Speaker, assuming that Phelan loses. But there are just an equal amount of Democrats who are climbing over one another to get into Dan Patrick's Senate and really get nothing done. So that race was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's the opportunity to represent a very large district. Our Senate districts are now larger than our congressional districts, but it's also not much of an opportunity to have a lot of autonomy and power when you're in the minority party in that Senate. So yeah, very good. All right, well, Alex, you have to go. You had to run at 9:45. It was great to have you back at the Tribune.
This was fun.
A longtime politics team member before moving on, and great to see you. Let's give Alex a hand. Thank you very much. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, though. As Matt mentioned, we have the microphones up here in the aisle. So if anyone in the room would like to ask a question, but it also looks like maybe Matt has some questions for online that we'll post to the panel.
I
in the
do,
meantime.
just to give enough time for folks here in person. And apologies if some of these questions that have come in as I've been doing some other things behind the scenes were discussed. But this person writes, Stan Lambert, HD 711, as did Drew Darby, HD 72. What was different about these two races compared to the other incumbents who did not win?
Yeah, so I wrote about Lambert's race in particular, so I'll touch on that some more. In some cases, like not a ton differentiated the House incumbents that won versus the one that lost. I mean, Lambert won by 5 or 6 points, so it was close. He had a relatively weaker challenger, a woman named Liz Case, who had only recently relocated permanently from Dallas County. A lot of people in the district kind of viewed her as a carpetbagger in that sense, even though she was backed by Abbott and Trump. It was one of the rare misses for the two of them in that. I also think that, generally speaking, Darby and Lambert are both sort of the older school of Republican, very get along in a lot of ways, but deep roots in their communities. And that may not count for much in House primaries anymore, but it counted enough here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agreed with what you said earlier about how all politics is national now. But I mean, these districts are small enough, particularly in the primary electorates, that if you have really strong relationships with the Republicans in your district, that can help you. And I think it might not save you, but it can maybe give you a little bit of an edge to hold on to your seat at certain times.
A reminder for those joining us online, you can go to texastribune.org/ask to ask your questions, and just another nudge for our in-person audience if you'd like to ask any questions of our panel. This person writes, with Texas's open primaries where Dems could vote GOP or GOP vice versa, were there any signs of strategies using this?
Well, I think that in the cities, you saw that happening. You saw a good bit of crossover happening in the largest counties. You also saw some of that happening in South Texas. And I think that also may have played a little bit of a role in why Roland Gutierrez didn't perform as well. You had several competitive Republican primaries happening in South Texas, and that coincidentally is also the region that Roland Gutierrez needed to run the board in. And so if you saw, about a quarter of the crossover from Democrats going over to Republicans happening in South Texas, then that could have made an impact there. I think I've heard that, a significant portion of Travis County voters, Democratic voters, ended up voting Republican. And I think that there's been a push within the Republican Party of Texas to get away from the current way primaries are handled and go to closed primaries. And so this next legislative session could be interesting on that open-closed primary fight.
And if I can say something about South Texas in particular, which is so interesting, is that because it's been historically so Democratic, a lot of the Republican voters there are very new Republican voters. So they have there's a lot of family and friend relationships that go across the two parties. So you did see quite a bit of, in the congressional race in 34, Vicente Gonzalez did send out a lot of mailers encouraging folks to tell their friends and family who are Republicans or registered in the Republican Party to vote in a certain way. Yeah.
I always like to look at the propositions at the end to get a sense. For those who don't know, the GOP primary, there are propositions at the end on various policy positions of the party. A lot of them, most of them, are sort of red meat, kind of affirm your belief in certain issues. Things like, should Texas eliminate property taxes? Should they, create a border protection unit and deploy additional state law enforcement forces and things like that. I've been looking up the results of those on my phone as these guys were talking, and for instance, the Border Protection Unit got 90% yes, 9% no. A few of them, got a little bit higher no's, around 22. The lowest one, I think, was around 4%. I'm scrolling to try to see which one it was really quick. It was, should the Constitution be amended to require proof of citizenship before any individual can be registered to vote? So if I had to guess based on that, I would say somewhere in the 4 to 9% range of people were either independents or Democrats, maybe crossing over to vote, particularly because they wanted to affect one of those races. But that's my very non-scientific analysis there.
Yes, Glenn Williams. This is probably obvious to everyone in the room except me. Are Democrats did they cross over just to vote against Trump? And was that the sole reason for doing it, or were there other reasons?
I don't think that was the sole reason. I think if you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of a Democrat in Texas, in what is generally a pretty, I think, pessimistic year nationally for Democrats, you're thinking, okay, if it's going to be bad in Texas, how can I at least make it the least bad or vote for the least bad Republicans, in my view? So yeah, I think there were Democrats who are like, you know what, I'd rather be on the record for Haley at this point. But also in some of the statewide judge races, the CCA ones that Paxton's and Dorsey's won, and also certainly the local races with Republicans that were, of course, more competitive usually than the Democrats.
Yeah, I think if you live in a county that's kind of got one party rule as well, you might sometimes cross over to vote in a local primary that that really affects your life. It wouldn't surprise me if some Republicans in Travis County voted, in an attempt to unseat the district attorney, Jose Garza, or maybe to support Kim Ogg in Houston as well. So, there can be, sometimes it's the top of the ticket. I'm sure there were people who were like, I don't want Donald Trump. I'm going to vote against Donald Trump any opportunity I get, but others, might have had more specific and local reasons to do so as well.
A question from online. Based on the changeover in pro-voucher races, do you think we will see any movement for a special session before the next main session in 2025?
Yeah, so Governor Abbott, he needed to pick up 11 pro-voucher candidates. And it seems like he probably did enough to close the gap. Right now, I believe we're looking at 9. That's not including the runoffs that still have to be counted. So, that alone gets them close to the finish line. And then you got to wonder how many of those anti-voucher Republicans are going to be as insistent as they were after seeing what happened to all their friends. So I think he probably got there, and we're probably going to see that still be very contentious. Still going to be a lot of members who are going to get as pro public education of a voucher bill that they can, but it's probably going to happen.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Renzo said. I mean, there is no point in having a special session. The new legislature won't convene until January. It's a much more favorable lineup then. Wait for that.
Yeah, I was wondering if it might have been interesting if he really wanted to move quickly, because there is a lot of school funding not related to vouchers that kind of got tied up in this. Like, I was trying to kind of go through a thought experiment in my mind last night of what if he called a special before the runoffs, right? And those 8 candidates could possibly find a way to help save themselves. I don't really think, though, those who lost would have any incentive to vote pro vouchers now. Like, they've already lost and they've already made their stand. So why would they change their vote? I think you're probably right. It probably makes more sense to just wait till January. We're getting closer every day, anyways.
Donald Sampley, can you speak to the outside money from Pennsylvania and from West Texas, Don and the Wilkes brothers, and the effect it had on both of these races?
Well, I can speak best about House District 2, where you had Jill Dutton running as a fresh incumbent and just recently won her runoff, well-funded candidate. The challenger was Brent Money, who was backed by West Texas oil money, and he got almost all of his, well, I won't say almost all of his support, but a lot of his financial and advertising support came from that aspect, and he ended up defeating the freshly elected. When I mean freshly elected, I mean 30 days elected incumbent. So I know that made the difference there. And I think in the congressional race with Tony Gonzalez and Brandon Herrera, right? You saw Herrera getting a lot of outside money. And also on the school voucher, it's all outside money. On the school voucher side, a lot of that money came from out of state.
I want to say two things about that. First, I guess maybe let's address the money. You know, of course, the Dunn and Wilkes, the West Texas oil billionaires, have been playing the long game for a very long time. They have been, you know, forcing, you know, funding primary challenges to, you know, varying degrees of success. And there have been a lot of years where that money kind of poured in and it didn't do much. And we've talked a little bit about how that can still influence things, right? Because if you're worried that some billionaire is going to give your campaign challenger, you know, $200,000, that's going to be a big headache for you, even if you do get to hold onto your seat. And I think that weighs on people's minds. This, I think, was by far their most successful election, you know, at least in the past decade, and that will have a major impact on the way the state is governed going forward. The other kind of out-of-state money that Jeff Yass, I'm actually not entirely sure how to pronounce that, but you know, he gave Governor Abbott $6 million, which Abbott kind of put aside to spend during this primary. And one of the things I think we noticed, correct me if y'all disagree with this, but that money wasn't, that came from someone who was very pro school vouchers, but the money wasn't necessarily just spent focusing on vouchers. It was raising all different kinds of attacks related to the border and other things that, you know, play extremely well in the Republican primary. And it matters, you know, to be able to go on the air and have the kind of campaign resources to attack an incumbent who is usually going to be far more well known in the district than you are. I have no doubt that money made a difference. How much of a difference, it's obviously hard to measure.
Yeah, on that comment about voucher money being used to fight on the border is just the most important issue to voters in Texas. Several of those pro-voucher candidates, their top issue that they were running on at the top of their mailers was always the border. And it was as much, if not more, of a talking point for them. And the governor saying, I can't trust the incumbent on vouchers. I can't trust them on the border. I can trust this other candidate on the border.
The other thing I wanted to say is when you were talking about HD2, it kind of reminded me, you know, you have this race where one candidate wins and then a month later loses by not a small margin. And I think it should remind us that as we go into the runoffs, that the context and the timing really does matter in these races, right? And in that special election, of course, Democrats could vote as well, and that made a difference. But in this election, Donald Trump was on the ballot, and that's going to bring out more people than will come into these runoffs, where in a lot of districts, the most high-profile race in that, in that runoff ballot will be the state house race. And it's going to be a very different electorate. And so we shouldn't just assume because someone was trailing, even Dade Phelan was trailing after the vote that night, that necessarily means it's just going to automatically lose as well. It's going to be a very different group of people voting. There's going to be a lot of money in a lot of these races, and a lot could kind of change there as well.
So I'd like to close with a question about process for all of you. You all had a very late night, and that's being able to provide some context and understanding for the immediate results. But, and without having to go into specific stories, investigations, or anything like that, what does a politics team now kind of look to in the days ahead? Is it going back at that is it looking back at that information? What are the conversations you're having? Again, more broadly, where is your attention turned to next?
It's a good question. I think I think one of the questions that we need to be asking is, how is this, it's not just individual races. This election is going to change how this state is governed, and trying to make sense of that, what that will mean. This is a very conservative state already, but what that will mean in terms of who's in charge, what kind of incentives are pushing folks, is something that we're going to have to sort of try to understand and help our readers understand.
Yeah, I mean, I am interested in exploring what I had consistently heard from talking with primary voters all over the state in the past, 6-8 weeks, is that they really, really don't like people they elect who, in their view, end up being compromisers or negotiators in Austin. And they are increasingly liking like a more aggressive, bombastic type of candidate. And while I can understand the appeal of those people, when a critical mass of them get to the Capitol, it becomes very hard to govern. So I think that we just had a horrifically contentious legislative year last year. I think that we might be on track for a more fractious one next year because of the composition of the legislature. And I think we need to explore what are the forces that are driving that.
I'm going to go through several layers. I mean, Zach, you said earlier that, all politics are kind of nationally driven now. But historically, Texans have had a huge influence in Congress in terms of what that national story is. But with more members retiring, more seasoned members retiring, and being replaced with folks who have very little political experience, who take their cues from people like Donald Trump, Texas's influence in that conversation is waning. And a lot of members of the Texas Republican delegation are very concerned about this, especially older ones. They say that this is probably one of the most decreased diminished days of Texas influencing in Congress now. So kind of seeing how these younger folks are going to take these new roles, these seats that they might have for decades because these are such safe seats, and how they're going to bring Texas to that national conversation as opposed to just taking cues from national figures.
Yeah, I guess a little hypothetical that I've been kicking around the newsroom the last couple of days has been, does a Senate Majority Leader John Cornyn let a U.S. Attorney General nominee Ken Paxton through the U.S. Senate? I don't know. But going to Zach's point about what is the legislature going to look like next year? One thing I'm looking ahead to is, what are the concessions that Democrats are going to make to the next speaker as far as what rules they support? Do they give up their committee chairmanships to still have influence over who the current speaker is? We'll see how far they're going to go.
It's definitely going to be a fascinating couple of months, well, really rest of the year in Texas politics. So lots more to talk about, lots more to write about and pay attention to. But I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you everyone for being here. And a big thanks to these guys for waking up early.